thrilled to hear it live or really fucking disappointed. It's called Positively 139th Street. It's often been said, perhaps flippantly, and by men older and wiser than I, that if you have the right amount of money, a hearty will, and the burning desire, you can buy anything in New York City. I hadn't been to New York for 25 years when I returned for a week-long vacation with my girlfriend Jacqueline recently. Having now done my fair share of research on the subject, I feel comfortable saying that it isn't true that you can buy anything in New York City. You cannot, for instance, buy out your white guilt when wandering the streets of Harlem uptown from West 116th Street. There's not enough money on the planet. You also cannot buy a smile or a good day wish from a clerk at a drugstore or a fellow traveler on the subway. It was bizarre. I cautioned Jacqueline, being the more paranoid and observant of the two of us, against sticking out like a tourist in the city. We were not to look blankly at our phones and argue with Siri about what direction we were supposed to be walking in. We were not to ask for help purchasing tickets on the subway. We were not to show the amount of cash we had on hand when purchasing something from a street vendor. We were not to gawk in awe for an unreasonable amount of time at the iconic sights we'd heretofore only seen in films. We broke all of these rules within the first 2 hours. But what we discovered was that we didn't have to be concerned about any of them. Those things didn't give us away as tourists. It was something much smaller, something neither of us had anticipated, though in hindsight, should have. Politeness. Being polite in New York City is tantamount to being a man ablaze in an ICU burn ward. New Yorkers don't have time to apologize for knocking you over on their way down the steps to the A train. Fuck it, I've got shit to do, you'll be fine, who cares? This observation on my part is odd for a few reasons, not the least of which being that I have a near fatal allergy to random interaction and idle chit-chat with strangers on the street. I have to fight hard to stifle a sneer and a single cocked eyebrow when my interaction with a restaurant server extends beyond the required amount of information for the transaction. Hi, hello, what do you have? What do you recommend? I'll have that, check please, have a good night. The minute they begin to ramble on about the long shift they're working, or the trouble their kids are in, I fantasize about leaping onto the table, leaning down into their faces, and bellowing, I could not give less a fuck about anything than I do about what you're saying right now. No one would ever accuse me of being overly friendly. Certainly not in the street with strangers, and definitely not when I'm in an unfamiliar city and I'm already paranoid that I'll be singled out as an easy mark for whatever hustle someone is working. And a hustle is being worked on every street corner. And while I and most of my small circle of friends and slightly larger circle of acquaintances take it for granted that I'm not a friendly person, I never realized just how polite I am. I am always very pleased and thank you when I need or receive something, and I default to calling my elders sir and ma'am with only a slight hint of hopefully imperceptible irony. I was born in New Jersey. I lived there for the first 5 years of my life, and while I've now spent 22 of my 30 years on this planet residing in the state of Florida, I go red with rage when someone dares to imply I'm a Floridian. Yet compared to the native New Yorkers I encountered over the course of my trip, I found myself coming off like a caricature in a William Faulkner novel. I might as well have been talking with a molasses-filled Savannah drawl and wearing a cornflower blue linen suit and a red bow tie. It was destabilizing to say the least. And around the time I discovered I wasn't nearly as bohemian as I'd hoped, probably as early as the second day, I started to fake it to fit in. That too busy for this shit attitude is like a dangerous virus. If I bumped into someone in the street, I'd sneer. How fucking dare they be in my way where I chose to walk? If an obvious tourist, fanny pack, tucked in jeans, shorts and all, asked me for directions, even though I had no idea where the hell I was, I'd shrug, huff, and charge away. I'd wait for a block or two before being overwhelmed with flattery at being mistaken for a local. It's understandable that the common trope when referring to New Yorkers is their lack of courtesy. It's a harrowing city. Nothing is ever easy or simple. Every second counts when you use mass transit. If they take the time to excuse themselves when knocking a grandmother over a turnstile on their way down to the subway platform, it could mean the difference between getting to work on time and being 20 minutes late. I do understand all of those things, but it takes a significant amount of getting used to. What really got me though, especially in Harlem where we rented an apartment on 139th Street for the week, were the children. What a singular experience it must be to grow up in Manhattan. If you're a child of the city, the streets and alleys and subways are your playground. I think back now on the bullshit and idiocy I got up to when I was in middle school. Take that and add an inexpensive mass transit system that you can get that can get you all the way to another state. I'd probably be some sort of coked out gun runner by now. These children, like the adults, had that impervious 1,000-yard stare as they walked block to block. The periphery was irrelevant to them. They knew how many streets they had to travel before they arrived at their destination, and unless danger or opportunity presented itself, there was no deviation, and god damn it, it made it nearly impossible to practice my white guilt head nodding on anyone there, try as I might. Many days and nights of eating and drinking followed. The weather was relatively warm, and during the day, Jacqueline and I avoided tourist traps like the plague, and did our best to navigate the city like people who live there would. We took in some standard fare, the MoMA, the Museum of Natural History, a taping of The Daily Show, a sketch show at the UCB Theater, the Hotel Chelsea, Keene Steakhouse, getting lost in the Ramble in Central Park, Rockefeller Center. On the third day, the holy shit, it's New York awe wore off. On the fifth day, our feet began to ache so badly and became so populated by blisters that we have to return to the apartment late in the afternoon to rest before dinner. It was a lame but necessary function of keeping the trip going. On the sixth day, the subway grime we had to scrape from our shoes and the bags of trash 4 feet tall lining the streets began to wear on us. The food wasn't as good as we'd hoped. The weather wasn't as crisp. The days were long. We found out, rather heartbreakingly, that we might not be cut out for the greatest city in the world. We weren't planning on living there, but discovered we absolutely couldn't. We found out just how suburban we really are. I like having space. I like having a driveway and a car, and absolutely zero chance of hearing my neighbor's conversation or television through the wall. On our last night there, as I stood smoking a cigarette on the stoop in front of the Strivers Row brownstone apartment we were renting, a man paused as he passed me on his way down the street. He smiled and asked, "How are you tonight?" I smiled back. Finally, yes, someone finally asked that. I was excited. Good, how are you? And then he launched into what can only be described as an impromptu but awkward rap that I won't try to replicate here. But the gist of it was, "Listen here, sir, I'm not a beggar, but a poet, making change and asking for it too, wouldn't you know it? Change is good, but what bills is bills to hold and to pay, so I can make my change with the bills I crave. When change it comes, and it will, I ain't dumb." I glared at him and cut him off at the pass. Listen, you're wasting your time." He paused, that sinking look a fisherman gets when the bass is just a little wiser than he thought, and wriggles off the line, creeping over his face. "How could I waste your time?" he asked. "Look, 2 things right away, okay?" I said. "First, I don't have any money to give you, so I don't want you to get all the way to the end so I feel like I'll owe you something." "All right," he said, "I appreciate your honesty. What's the second thing?" "You were using way too many goddamn puns in that poem of yours. If you want someone like me to give you cash, you're going to have to crank that down from 11 to about 3. Way too many puns. Way too many." He shook his head and walked away in a huff. I waited until he paused to look back at me, anger growing in his eyes, and then I casually flicked my half-smoked cigarette onto the sidewalk and walked into the foyer of the building, letting the heavy iron door close behind me as he shuffled up to the street. I waited until he rounded the corner, then I ran back to the curb, put out the cigarette I tossed, and walked it to the nearest trash can. On my last day there, I realized I could be a New Yorker in action, if not spirit, but I couldn't just drop shit on the street. There was no way to distinguish my garbage from the tons upon tons already strewn around the city. But a southern gentleman such as myself doesn't litter. Fuck, still a hayseed, probably always a hayseed. Thank you.